stage 6 load shedding tonight. And that means we need to lose 6,000 megawatts of power from the grid to avoid catastrophe. That can mean, if you take my area, for example, in one 24-hour period, I will be 11 hours, in fact more than that, without power. And of course it varies depending on which day of the week you're on, but it can be that extreme. So let's get a real understanding what stage 6 means, and whether there's hope from what we heard from Pravin Gordhan, Minister Gordhan, this evening. I'm joined now by energy expert Hilton Trollip. Hilton, thank you so much for your time. So the Minister is telling us that it's stage 6 for now, possibly tomorrow as well, but there is a wage deal. And the unions, and I've seen their release, have already agreed that from tomorrow things are going to start getting back to normal. The Minister has laid the blame for stage 6 squarely at the door of people who have intimidated Eskom workers. He showed us pictures of houses that were petrol bombed. He says people have had their car tyres slashed, and people have received intimidatory phone calls. He says if that stops, we can get back to stage 4. If he's right, and it does sound quite hopeful because the unions seem to be saying that they're on board, does that mean that this stage 6 was just a bad blip?
Sally, I like what Pravin Gordhan did, around exposing state capture, etc. But I'm afraid I have to disagree with him that he is in any position to say that we won't go to stage 6 if the labour dispute is resolved, because the chronic shortage of reliable stations and sufficient power stations on the South African system is such that there is a risk of stage 6. And I think Eskom Executive Management last year already outlined this very clearly in their system status report. So whilst, of course, our leadership needs to keep calm, and of course, the kind of intimidation and violence that was going on is wrong, I think to start changing the main narrative of the problems with the power system and blaming it on things other than the fact that there is a long-term problem with the amount of power on the grid and that has been put onto the grid in the past 10 years, and the current plans to solve that aren't sufficient to solve the problem, I think is playing politics, and I think it's unfortunate. And I also think that any attempt to start shifting the blame for a systemic shortage of power on the system, which is the responsibility of the energy minister. Only the energy minister has the legal power to, one, plan to put new generation on the grid, allow it on the grid, and make sure that it gets onto the grid. Eskom has to deal with the results of that process, that long-term process. So I think it's unfortunate, and I think that also this doesn't talk to some bigger issues. This system is really stressed, not just the power stations, but the people, the management, the political system, etc., by serious chronic problems. To blame it symptoms such as when the stress pops out in labour relations or financial problems, etc., I think is not helpful.
Yeah, but perhaps a bit simplistic. Let's talk about stage 6. Now, my understanding, and we've got a lovely a graphic that comes, I think, from Eskom, level 6, stage 6 of load shedding means that we have to lose 6,000 megawatts from the grid. First of all, what is our total grid capacity? Because I've seen various figures from 35,000 right up to 58,000.
So that all depends on definitions, but let's just really simplify it. We've probably got of the order of about 50,000 megawatts of power stations in various statuses of repair on the system, of which probably about 45,000 could be called the stations available that should be available on the system if they all work. Of course, some always have to be off the grid for maintenance. But then there's a thing called unplanned maintenance. And this is where one of the biggest problems is. One, we don't have enough power stations, but two, those that we've got at any stage this year, the average number that are out of commission, not working, either to be maintained or broken, is 40% of those. So only 60% are working. And this is because they're old, most of them, or badly designed and manufactured, the two new ones.
I want to talk to you about, and this is something that Ted Blom, also an energy expert, often says. We say, oh, we're at stage 6, that's 6,000 megawatts off the grid. He goes, no, you've also got to add in what Eskom is doing with areas that aren't paying, this so-called load reduction. And let's get into that terminology, because often that means that an area or parts of Soweto, for example, where there's a non-payment issue, will be 4 hours without power. He said if you add up all of that, we are actually already at a stage 8 or 9. Do you agree with him?
So I wouldn't call... I think that's also possibly mixing things up, but yes. If we were to supply all the areas that need electricity, without regard for whether they're paid for it or not, then we'd have a bigger shortage. Ted, I haven't made that estimate myself. Ted's usually fairly, I haven't seen him completely make up figures before. So, yeah, I'd go along with the fact that there's another 2,000 megawatts of so-called load reduction on the go. There's also, Sally, there's something called many businesses, large industries have contracts with Eskom to switch off when there's a power shortage. And what happens is they actually get paid not to use electricity. So they lose their production. In other words, that factory could have been producing at that stage, and Eskom loses the revenue from selling to them. And that could also be another couple of 1,000 megawatts.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's invisible, and that just goes right off the economy.
I want to ask you a question. It's the big, scary question. Pravin Gordhan was asked about the possibility of a total blackout, because that's what we all fear. And the message from Eskom, the message from him is, no, the load shedding is carefully managed to avoid exactly that. Do you think we will ever get to a point of total blackout? Because it's scary when we see how much power is being taken from the grid. I think stage 6 estimates, or was it stage 8? We'll look at the graphic now. It means about half our power is not being utilised. Could we ever get to that awful point of a blackout?
So Sally, the process of a system collapse, in other words, an unmanaged load shedding, is completely different from managed load shedding. And that's a function of the system operator who controls connecting the power stations to the grid, connecting load to the grid, and making sure they're balanced. Eskom has shown itself to be excellent at planned load shedding and dealing with really stressful situations of much less supply than there is demand. It's a separate issue. We could go to stage 8, to stage 10, to stage 12. They can switch off more and more and more and still run a stable system. I have every confidence in Eskom that they can continue doing that. Of course, there is the issue that's now come up, and I'm not an expert in this, the security issues. Once you start losing control of illegal labor action, etc., and that takes us into completely different territory. But it's important to connect the ongoing stress of the shortage with the higher likelihood of bad labor relations and demoralized workers.
Yeah, so you make an excellent point, actually, is that people are exhausted within that system as well. Something that the Minister, Pravin Gordhan, said tonight is that he lauded Eskom for selling off those 18 parcels of land, or the land leases, so that people can come in and do those independent contracts. He did allude to the fact that Gwede Mantashe, the Energy Minister, is the one who can clear the way. And he just said at one point, we've got to get rid of all the damn red tape. And that's a direct quote from Pravin Gordhan. So there was a gentle nudge there, I thought. He says if those things go well, that within the next 2 to 3 years, we could see our grid really stabilising. Do you agree with him?
I agree that certainly those 1,800 megawatt projects will help a lot to decrease the amount of load shedding and the risk of load shedding. There's also, in addition to those 18, what happened last year was the president, in fact, ordered the energy minister to raise the limit from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts for the requirement for licensing from NERSA. So what anybody can do now, if they meet technical safety specifications, they can build an up to 100 megawatt power station and connect it to the grid and trade electricity over the grid, supply their factory themselves, sell electricity to other people or to municipalities. And what that is they just relaxed the requirement for NERSA to license those. But I have to say that was done. The energy minister said it himself, that the president twisted his arm to do that. But yes, that plus the ESCOM 18, plus many businesses, it is estimated that there's some 44,700 megawatts of projects which are going to come in under that relaxation of the licensing requirement. And that will take a lot of pressure off the grid. But I do want to add, we still need the correct mix. And the kinds of things that are going to come on are going to be wind and PV, but we still need batteries and we still need backup turbines, etc., to provide power. So we still need the right mix, and the energy minister has to make sure that those get onto the grid.
Right, so we've got a number of hoops still to jump through, but thank you so much for chatting to us this evening and just giving us such insight into where we're going regarding our energy. That is expert on energy, Hilton Trollip. And we're going to